When Boeing announced in 1997 it would build a $400 million rocket booster plant in Decatur, Alabama, there was talk about a new economic boom in the area. After all, this highly sought industrial prize will employ as many as 3,000 people when it is completed. Decatur, a North Alabama river town, has a long history of booms and busts. In 1888, it was called the Chicago of the South, and the population grew so rapidly that many people had to live in tents. However, the yellow fever scare and then the Great Depression of the 1930s threatened to turn Decatur into a ghost town. In the early years of the Depression, a massive, controversial federal program dramatically changed the landscape and revitalized what had become an impoverished region. In 1950, Washington produced a film, TVA Town, to show how the Tennessee Valley Authority transformed one Alabama town. TVA Town Revisited is a new look at the facts and fictions presented in that film on the 50th anniversary of its release. The film is original. The graphics are new.
Here, in the deep South, our people always lived on cotton and corn. In the good years, cotton was our cash crop. In the bad years, cotton was the cause of our poverty. Corn was the crop that gave us our basic food most years. In my grandfather's time, cotton and corn were perfect crops. But year after year, they robbed our earth of its power to hold against the heavy rains. By the time our people realized what was happening to their land, it was too late. Since I was a boy, a heavy rain was an enemy, striking fear into the hearts of the farmers and terrorizing river towns like mine, Decatur, Alabama. Decatur is the center of a 50-mile circle of farmlands. As editor of the only newspaper here, I think I knew the personal problems of most of her 11,000 people. And I shared their fears when the big rain of 1932 started to fall. The first day of the downpour, two friends of mine came to see me. One of them was worrying about his farm beside the river. The other was just worrying, the way a jobless man worries. He hadn't had a job since Decatur's only factory closed down, a casualty of the National Depression. They needed help, but what could I do for them with a typewriter? Words couldn't stop the rain. Newspaper editorials couldn't check the river. Once again, our plundered earth paid the price of a century of devotion to row crops like corn and cotton. The Tennessee River, flowing through our farmlands and bordering our city, rose up to claim a heavy price for our mistakes. The river spared nothing. Our farms were swamped. Our little city suffered along with the farms around us. The flood of 1932 was a disaster from which none could escape. The darkest hour in our history had begun. While the river slipped back to its banks, the sun beat down on our wretchedness. In the national elections that year, the people of Decatur joined the majority of the American people in electing a new national administration that promised direct action against the economic crisis that gripped the whole United States. In April 1933, we got the action we voted for, right at our doorstep. My newspaper carried the story. The government had created a new agency, TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, that was going to build dams to control floods in the 7 states through which the Tennessee River and its smaller tributaries flow. The new government said that this TVA could help us to win a better life. At what cost to our way of life? I wondered. All of us were curious, and some of us, like Sam Tyler, wondered if at last our fate had really changed. The TVA sent engineers to explain their plan to the peoples of the Tennessee Valley. Only a few of us were on hand to greet the first TVA engineer, for we couldn't quite believe that there was a cure for Decatur's sickness. Sam Tyler spoke for most of us when he asked what the TVA had to offer him personally. TVA, the engineer answered, offered us nothing but the tools with which we could help ourselves. Some wanted to know if the electric power generated by the dams would be given to us free. The answer was no. The electricity, as well as the fertilizer the TVA planned to make at Wilson Dam, would be sold to us at very low cost, for the TVA had to be self-supporting. I was worried what the TVA would do to our freedoms. Would TVA come to our valley as a super government to run our lives? Just the opposite, the engineer said. The TVA would be, and could be, only what the people in the valleys of the Tennessee themselves made it. This TVA engineer spoke as one of us, because he was one of us. TVA was made up of people like ourselves, and even as we spoke, that day, TVA was coming to life up and down the river, less than 50 miles from Decatur. When the fever of building ended, great shining dynamos stood ready to turn in Wheeler Dam, 35 miles from the city limits of Decatur. Our river was trapped, and the strength of it, wasted for centuries, was fed to the dynamos, and the dynamos made electricity out of this strength. And they sent this new power across quiet hills and meadows to farm families that had never known electric light, electric power, electric tools before. But there was something more. Our river had become a highway. At each of the new dams on the Tennessee River, there were now giant canal locks. For in building the flood control dams, the TVA's engineers had converted our river to a chain of gigantic lakes. Now, by passing ships and freight barges through the canal locks at each dam, cargo could be sent from lake to lake along the 1,000-mile route of the formerly useless river. When I saw the first barge sliding through the big lock nearest Decatur, I knew that navigation had become more than just a word on a TVA poster. Even the children understood that their city was no longer an isolated victim of the river, but a protected member of a vast new family of towns and cities along a controlled waterway. Now we realized that for the first time in our history, our city could be a port. Now we were linked to the commerce of our nation and of the world by cheap water routes. The products of our own farms and the products of mines and mills and factories 1,000 miles away could become cargo on the ships that now sailed hundreds of miles through the locks of TVA dams on the Tennessee River. River transport lowered the cost of the goods we bought from other regions, and it made our products cheaper for those who bought from us. We waited for industry to move into our city. We forgot that we still had something else: swamps that bred mosquitoes. Mosquitoes that carried malaria. Factory machines must be run by men, by healthy men. The doctors in our city knew the discouraging facts. 1/3 of our people were knocked out by malaria every year. 1/3 of us were too weak to work or even to care. The doctors also knew how little they could do to prevent malaria. We took the problem of malaria to the TVA, and TVA sent us engineers with a plan to eliminate malaria and machines to do the job. We listened carefully to these men. Drain the swamps where the mosquitoes breed, they said, and you will drive malaria away from your city. The machines dug ditches in the swampland, row after row to the river. When the last ditch was cut, TVA built a powerful pumping station to drain the swamp. And the pumps were powered by electricity from our dams. We knew that industry would never come to Decatur if we lost the fight against malaria. We didn't lose it. We won it. The pump sucked 100,000 gallons of swamp water every minute, enough to dry up the marshes in mosquito breeding season. The barges that plied our river had few reasons for stopping in Decatur. It was old Walt Gilbert who finally decided to do something about those barges. Just waving at them, he said, didn't help us much. Walt had an idea that might make Decatur a good place for a grain mill. He asked some of us to meet him at the railroad depot near his store. Walt had it all figured out this way. The big grain millers along the Great Lakes ground their grain and shipped it as flour to the south by rail. But suppose they could ship their grain down in barges and grind it here with our cheaper power. The millers would save money, and we'd have a new industry. That made a lot of sense to me. And the next thing I knew, I was a member of a Decatur committee making a 1,000-mile trip to Nebraska to tell the big grain millers that Decatur was the ideal place to build a grain mill. The Nebraska millers took us at our word, and I'll always say that the rehabilitation of Decatur got underway when giant machines broke the ground for that grain mill on our river front. I went down there every day to be sure I wasn't dreaming. At long last, the barges stopped at Decatur, loaded with wheat from fields 1,000 miles away to be ground in our gleaming new mill. And out of our own fields, safe from the ravages of flood, came more grist for the mill. We had a new market for corn. Hundreds of our people went to work in the mill, no longer afraid that malaria would pull them away from their jobs. A contagious spirit of confidence swept over Decatur. Our county agricultural agent brought every businessman in town to the new mill. "Look," he said, "there's no reason on earth why our cotton farmers can't grow wheat for this mill. No reason at all." He was right. Some of our businessmen organized a team to sell our farmers the idea of growing wheat. Sam Tyler laughed when they tried to sell him the idea. He said his cotton was doing fine, thanks to TVA fertilizers. Now, I wasn't part of the team, but I believed in the wheat idea. And maybe I said so a little too fiercely, and maybe Sam said yes just to keep me quiet. Anyway, Sam was one of the first group of farmers to plant a test crop of wheat under supervision of the county and the TVA. We had new harvesting machinery specially designed for our region. It was good machinery. But more important than the machines was the lesson we learned. We proved to ourselves that we could grow our own wheat. And we were soon growing enough of it to supply the new mill with all the grain it needed, with enough left over to feed a few cows and a few small flocks of chickens for family use. At first, we couldn't raise enough poultry to send to market. But we were getting impatient with little plans. Action. That was the answer of Decatur's people. We had stopped surrendering to challenges like this one. From businessmen and farmers came the cry, "Let's create our own market." We talked the problem over at one meeting after another, and finally we decided to take a big step together. We were learning to help ourselves by joining our strength in mutual cooperation. More than 1,000 farmers and city people agreed to put up the money to build a cheese plant. We were no longer afraid of the future in Decatur. When the new cheese plant opened, the whole community felt the benefits. From the very first day, the plant paid cash for every pound of milk our farmers delivered to the door, and it paid wages to those who filled the new jobs it created. After the cheese plant got started, we suffered a bad cotton year. Our old enemy, the boll weevil, destroyed most of the crop. Cotton crop ruined? All right, don't cry about it. Find a new crop, a cash crop easier to produce and more resistant to plagues than cotton. We asked the county agents and the TVA farm advisors to help us find such a crop. When they came around, they were 2 jumps ahead of us. They told us that some Decatur businessmen were so encouraged by the success of the cheese plant that they would finance a poultry packing plant if the Decatur farmers could deliver enough fowl. They surveyed every farm in the valley. Again, Sam Tyler was one of our first farmers to say he'd try a new cash crop. The chicken house that Sam built on the money he borrowed was not long in paying for itself. Here, every 10 weeks, Sam and his wife raised 5,000 birds from chicks to eating size. That gives them 5 cash payments a year for their poultry. The grain fed to the chickens is grown and milled right here in Decatur, and the birds never leave the house until the day they are taken to market. Cheap electric power made it possible for Sam to install automatic watering troughs and raise thousands of chickens with a minimum of labor. And with the introduction of large-scale poultry raising in our farmlands, a new industry rose along the Decatur riverfront, a poultry packing plant. Like the cheese plant, the new packing house bought, and still buys, every pound of chickens our farmers can raise. And, like all new industries, this one created new jobs for the people of the city. Confidence born of success encouraged our farmers to expand their cattle herds beyond their original plans. Our cheap electric power enabled dairymen to use milking machines, and milk production climbed so high that Decatur's businessmen were convinced we were ready for our local bottling plant. We were. Less than 20 years after the floods that nearly destroyed us, Decatur has twice the population we had before TVA. Our main streets are lined with busy stores. New factories hum where the weeds used to grow along a deserted riverfront. We still grow cotton, sure. There will always be cotton in the South. But today, cotton is our slave, not our master. The cotton field ends where the factory begins. Decatur today has many factories like this one, the world's largest copper tube mill. But we have more than machinery, crops, and stores. We have new hope and faith. New houses, good houses, are going up steadily all over the city. Most of us own our own homes, new or old. Our goal of a better world for our children comes closer to reality. Already we have given them not only better homes, but better schools. Good schools have become as important to us as good crops and successful industry. We want our children to learn to use the tools of science that lifted Decatur out of despair. All of us have caught the spirit of learning. County home economics workers are busy teaching farm wives in the remote sections of our valley. At the agricultural experiment station in our region, scientific work is underway to increase the quality and the quantity of our farm products. For we have learned that it is up to man himself whether nature helps him to live or breaks him for trying. After 15 years, I still manage to join our school children when they make their annual visit to the TVA Dam near Decatur. And each year, it seems to me that the children breathe a unique life into that great creation of steel and stone. Their joyous presence makes the dam a monument to the eternal dream of every father, the indestructible dream of making his children's life better than his own. We have tried to show them the truth in the rebirth of Decatur, the knowledge that people who live and work together in freedom can always find a will and a way to rise above disaster. That is the secret of the story of Decatur.
Videotape copies of this program may be purchased by calling 1-800-463-8825. Learn more about this and other programs from the Alabama Experience on the World Wide Web at www.alabamatv.org.